So I'll show you images that are historical and contemporary, whatever that means. I challenge the constructions of those. Also, I think the emphasis of the idea of evidence is that it's always around the legality of framing of how we understand evidence, evidence in relation to body, evidence in relation to documentation. And so evidence is always founded within the space of truths. And so the plurality of truths as something that's more, for me, is diverse, because South Africa's construction of evidence was based around this notion of truth, one truth, the notion of truth linked to amnesty and the Christian-centric idea that when you provide evidence and you speak truth, you will not be punished and you will be free. So the truth will set you free. And I think these kind of words and language has embodied our struggle within South Africa, and it has really greatly impacted on the fact that we are not free and that we still don't have any information around everything that has happened during apartheid, and the fact that the state destroyed 44,000 tons of evidence on the eve of our democracy also impacted. So when we look at the historical side of our documentation, this is work that I've digitized and worked with a photographer who was documenting more than 52 years of South Africa's work, Alf Kumalo, and most of his work is still in a state of chaos, not archived or not digitized, and so the question of what is a body of evidence and where is it located is very questionable. And given the fact that his work in particular very much speaks to the kind of challenges that we have when we think about truth and evidence, and he was one of those photographers who was located within the inside of the liberation movement. Not one of the photographers that I think he was much more closer to what was happening. And so when we look at an archive in this kind of state, I wonder where we are located in relation to the framing of what has happened in our past. This was an intervention that we did as a collective at the Center for Historical Reenactments. Many of you know Gabby Mobile. And we spent a weekend residency trying to make sense of what are we doing? We kept asking ourselves that, because when you handle documentation and evidence, that you don't know who you are looking at when you are making a kind of portraiture of black and white images. Who are these people? Where are their lives? Where are they located? Who are they? What has been their experience? And all these issues. And I think for me, the very link between evidence and disposable people very much come to mind, that the whole emphasis of South Africa's apartheid structure was based on the issue of disposability, that to destroy black South Africans was the ultimate intention. And so for me, the linkage between evidence and disposability and race very much are intertwined. And I think just to kind of think through also the notion of evidence and iconography is also a very challenging issue, because we always want to select words, language, images that have to change a moment. They have to be within a frame of shifting. And so what really happens when those who are outside of the frame, are we really part of adding to this notion of disposability? Do they not matter? So I think you're probably familiar with some of these exhibitions around, again, the confinements of how apartheid has been constructed, this rise and fall of apartheid. So it's very much like this time-based thing. It's not a continuum. Like it had a moment and it ended in 1994. And actually I argue that it still continues. And evidence really shows that there's a continuation and a continuum within this. And so I really challenge exhibitions like this that kind of try to confine trauma and issues within a time-based thing, which for me it doesn't really make much sense. So in terms of contemporary work and what we're doing, and what I'm doing is really linking the issues around this idea of the deconstruction of race, racism, looking at those intersections in relation to queer work and bodily work. And so the current work that we're doing is very much based on evidence gathering, evidence documentation. One of the issues that continue from apartheid to the contemporary is the invisibility of black queer bodies and what this means. And so a lot of the work that we currently doing is based on, sorry, there was one image that's not here now, but just to explain that this image, it also appeared in the Rise and Fall of Apartheid exhibition. It's a banner that we made for the exhibition based on the residency, but also this is a 1985 image of a massacre in South Africa. And this was the banner that came up in that particular period. And so what does it mean that 1985 and 2014, that the same message and the same issues reside, and how do we present this within our visual narratives is very important. And so what does documentation mean now? In various forms, in forms of beyond the analog, which was what we really saw in terms of materiality of the way documentation happened and the limitation of the consumption of these images. Photography was very much bound to the privileged few that had cameras. Right now to the digital period where institutions like ourselves are really much more at the forefront of documenting and gathering evidence that the state is not doing around the increased murders related to transgender bodies, related to queer bodies. And for me, this continuum is very, very essential. And so the intimacy of our work and the constructions of trauma within this, and the evidence and the document is not to say that this exists. The evidence and the documentation is to say that we need to engage and construct our discussions around this. And so is evidence very much linked to the issues of what we call within a human rights framing of human dignity, respect, all of these kinds of constructions. And where do we frame this when we bring this into other kinds of curatorial spaces within the exhibition spaces? What is the impact of these documents when it is, when it's formulated within a white cube? And so when we think about it, recently we have put together exhibitions. This one was called Critically Queer, which really related to the kind of evidence that cannot be produced in countries that desire to produce this evidence, like in Nigeria or Zambia or Malawi. And this show I curated in South Africa, it traveled within the country, and it will be shown next year at the United Nations in Geneva, but to expand it into a more global conversation. And so what does it mean when we take these shows into spaces that are not ordinarily perceived as art spaces, or when we see these disgusting, horrible images and exhibitions at the UN of poverty-stricken children or black women carrying water on their heads, what is our responsibility here in the room to bring another form of documentation and evidence into those spaces, because ultimately that is where change happens. That's ultimately where influence happens. It doesn't happen over a cocktail in a white cube. And so I think that we need to bring these conversations into each other, so that we don't say, oh, you are a curator and you are an activist and you are a performer, but what are we actually by the end of the day doing to kind of shift what we are doing in these various ways? How do we make people less disposable, I think, is my ultimate issue. So I think I will just conclude on I wanted to just show you some of the work in the exhibition, and how do we bring these conversations in many ways, I think, together. This is work from an artist in Zambia, who's really, where sexuality is criminalized. What is it, the work of Milumbi Haimbe, who brings to the fore new images of challenging the notion of the superhero cartoons, and what does it mean to bring this work into kind of the art realm. And she is currently developing her work called The Revolutionist. This is an artist from Nigeria as well, again, using pidgin language to challenge the issues of body, the whole issue around state repression of the body, etc. So I think this kind of framing of where we are bringing documentation, what does it mean outside of, especially within the human rights framing, what does it mean outside of tribunals and courts? What does evidence really mean in our form of curatorial practice? So I think I will leave it at that, and then if you have questions or want to expand further, feel free to do so.